To tonight, the second edition of last week. I asked for your indulgence tonight. I woke up with a severe head cold and sore throat, so I'm going to do my best. But again, as I said last week, it's good that I'm suffering while I do this. So last week we talked about some traditional Christian beliefs and foundational, what I was called load-bearing structure. The 4 points were essentially important because they have to be said as the foundation of what comes today. So we didn't really talk extensively about suffering last week. We just talked about assumptions about God. The 3 assumptions being that God does exist, He has revealed Himself. That the God who revealed Himself is loving, that the way He relates to us is by loving us. And then that this same loving God has a providential will for us. And then the final point was that humankind has fallen. That means we're limited, we're mortal. There were some questions that came up after the session last week, and I wanted to clarify some things. So the first thing I wanted to clarify about last week was with some of the questions was the causes of suffering. First things I want to say, God did not create evil or death. Evil is a parasite. Evil results from the free will of God's creation. Perhaps you've never thought about it, but what would life be like if we didn't have free will? Because a lot of people, when they're suffering, they say, well, why would God allow someone to do this to someone who's innocent, or allow God to do these sort of things? But what would the universe be like if God ran around stopping us from everything? God, who is holy and is no unrighteousness in Him, is completely other. When He perceives us, even our slight sins are impurities. And what if He stopped us from those? That's a world of automatrons. That's a robotic world. And so part and parcel of the discussion we have is that evil is kind of like a risk that has to be taken in order for us to have free choice and free will. The sickness that exists in our world exists only because of sin. Generally because we live in a fallen world, but secondarily because sometimes we personally sin, we contribute to the fallenness of the world, and it perpetuates sickness and suffering. And then the world is fallen, which is also why we see natural disasters. So for me, that was to attempt to clarify some of the causes of suffering. God does not cause suffering. Now, I did say, and I was a little bit confusing in my answer about talking about suffering being sent by God. There are many faithful Christians in the history of the church who use the language about God sending them suffering. And that language is actually acceptable within our tradition. But just to be clear, so that you don't think differently, I want to read a passage from Thomas Hopko, a priest of blessed repose, who died a few years ago, who is a wonderful educated. He says, given the sinfulness of the world, its bondage to the devil, its groaning and travail, until its salvation in Christ, God Himself uses sickness and death for His own providential purposes as a means for man's salvation. God is not the cause of sickness, suffering, and death, but given their existence because of the devil's deceit and man's wickedness and sin, God employs them that man might be healed and saved in the forgiveness of sins. In this sense, and in only this sense, can it be said that God sends sickness to man. Therefore, when a spiritual person is sick, he recognizes that his illness is caused by sin, his own and the sins of the world. He does not blame God for it, for he knows that God has not caused it, and he does not wish it for his servants. He knows as well, through the providential plan of God and the salvation of Christ, that his sickness will be healed. When he says that, he doesn't mean necessarily in the temporal life, but that it'll be ultimately healed at the end of the age. He knows also that if God so wills, he can be healed of his sickness in this life in order to have more time to serve God and man on earth and to accomplish what he must according to God's plan. He knows as well that the very sickness itself can be the means for serving God. And he accepts it in this way, offering it in faith and love for his own salvation and for the salvation of the others. There is no greater witness to the love of God and faith in Christ than sickness endured with faith and love. The points I'm trying to clarify there are that God is not the author of sickness and death. Secondarily, that God does not specifically send us anything. But this world is full of sickness and death, and when we become sick or corrupt or sinful or anything, this is material that God can use in his own providence to bring us to repentance, to bring us to health and healing. So, those are my clarifications for last week. And this week we're going to be talking and moving on, and I'm going to talk about our responses to sufferings, how generally human beings respond to suffering, fallen human beings respond to suffering. We're also going to use some case studies from the Scripture. A case study is a technical term for those who have done clinical pastoral education. We sit down and write a verbatim with all the details of someone's life story and show them how the counseling appointment went or whatever the interaction went. And there's a few of these from the Scriptures we can pull out and see what they can teach us about how to approach suffering. And we're also finally going to talk about the possibility of redemptive suffering. That as if we follow Christ, that if we are attempting to live a traditionally Christian life, that suffering can become salvific and healing and actually just part and parcel of who we are, not necessarily a bad thing. Another quote from Father Hopko, and I promise I won't read you a lot of long quotes today. There are only two possible ways to deal with such sufferings. Either one humbly accepts them and transforms them into a way of salvation for oneself and others, or one is defeated by them with rebellion and rejection, and so curses God and dies, both physically and for eternity in the age to come. Now we can think of this, maybe you are familiar, you've studied the Holocaust, and or various people who are put in the prison camps associated with the Holocaust. Viktor Frankl writes a book about it, and in his book he is talking about, he's a psychiatrist, and he ends up talking about the meaning of life, finding meaning in life. His whole therapy, his therapeutic model is that those who find meaning can endure suffering. But he talks about the brutalities that he witnessed. And in that, in those brutalities, we see a little bit of what Father Hopko is saying, that many people become like ingrown hairs, so to speak. When they suffer, instead of finding meaning, instead of turning out, they turn within themselves. And in doing so, they often lack any sort of redemptive meaning, and they curse God and oftentimes die in such a way. Suffering provokes, it absolutely has to provoke a response. And we're talking about one of the other quotes Father Hopko I had heard him say at one time was, never say anything to somebody about suffering that you might not say to a woman who just witnessed her child be put into the furnace at Auschwitz. So we're talking about stuff that has a lot of gravity. I'm not just talking about you woke up and your alarm went off at the wrong time. I mean, we all can handle light afflictions and various things. Some of the sufferings in life, though, are so profound that they mystify us and they have a way of changing our soul. And so these are what we're doing here in these classes is ultimately we're talking about training. What can you do now while you're not suffering Or what can you do now while your suffering is light, so that when something comes in the future, you're prepared and you have a thought process to possibly enter into it in a redemptive way. So, our first case study is going to be from Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, we see Adam and Eve in the garden. God has given Adam and Eve a commandment not to eat of the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of the good and evil. She gets tempted, Eve does. She partakes of the fruit. And in doing so, one quick way to say that is that she chose death instead of life. And the early church fathers, they speak in this language. They would say that Eve, instead of choosing to follow God, who is life, Eve chose her own reasoning, and in doing so, she chose death. And as a natural consequence, because remember last week I mentioned that God, when He gave him the commandment, He didn't say, if you eat of this tree, I will kill you. He says, if you eat of this tree, you shall surely die. So as a natural consequence of partaking and breaking this commandment and choosing death, God allows them to experience their natural consequences. And their natural consequences are that they have an experience of nakedness and shame. Before, they're naked and unashamed. After, they see their nakedness and they are ashamed about it. And their conscience accuses them. And this is something that the early church fathers say a lot about, which is that their conscience stands over them as a judge and says, what have you done? As if they had committed, in our mind, eating a fruit and breaking a commandment is not a big deal. But this is the first sin ever committed. And so in the early church, they talk about it, about how sensitive their conscience would be, and how this conscience would have essentially a high-pitched scream at them and would terrorize them. So as a result, there's this interior disorder. Their soul becomes darkened, as I read last week from Romans. There's external disorder. We already talked about that. Natural disasters. And now you have to work the ground, and it puts forth thorns. They inherit corruption, first in their soul and then in their bodies. And then eventually we know just one generation, that Cain and Abel, that there'll be a murder. And so they have physical death. And then there's this sense of futility, because no matter what you do to survive, and no matter how much, like it says in Ecclesiastes, no matter how many castles you build and how much virtue you have, in the end, we're all going to die. And death is that great equalizer. So we see that there becomes in this a struggle for meaning. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And of course, exile from God. They're not allowed back into paradise, and they find themselves where they feel separated from God. But how did Adam and Eve respond when they fell? Well, we could say that when they fell, how God responded. It says that God responded when they fell, that He ran out to them immediately and looked for them in the garden. But their response was that when they saw themselves, they had this first experience of nakedness. Now, experiencing nakedness is not, they became ashamed. They were ashamed at what they thought. In the early church, some of the commentators say, before that they were robed in the light of God. And when that light was removed, they just saw that they were flesh and corrupt, and they weren't like the angels that they used to be in paradise. So in response to the shame, they cover themselves. They use fig leaves. So they take these dead leaves and they put them on them. They hide from God. God is out there saying, where are you, Adam? Where are you? Who told you this? And they're hiding. They blame each other, of course, when they're held to account. And they blame the snake. Ultimately, they blame the devil also. And then finally, Adam says, it was the woman that you gave me. God, it's really your fault. And as I say in catechism, one of the lessons from that is why husbands should never listen to their wives. You know I'm joking, right? All right. Shame demands an answer. The pain of shame in our life, and everybody has shame, and you can see it before and after. If you watch how little children are, They are raised with no self-consciousness. And then at a certain age, all of a sudden the light goes on and they see themselves. And one of the manifestations, they see themselves naked. You know, they realize that they need to cover themselves, that there's certain things. But a child doesn't have this self-awareness. But shame is actually more of an unpleasant, self-conscious emotion. And it's tied to a negative evaluation of ourselves. So it's actually a judgment against ourselves to say that somehow we are unworthy, that we are dirty, that we are bad, that my very being itself is a problem. And that's how shame is often understood even within psychological circles. So shame begs for a response, because when people experience shame, they feel as though they have to do something. And usually, fallen human beings, fallen humanity, which we all are of, the typical things that we'll do is that we'll cover ourselves, we'll try to cover our shames, we'll try to hide in some way from it, and we'll blame. Or, in arguing with ourselves in the shame that we have, we'll try to self-justify. We are going to prove to ourselves that we're not as worthless as we feel, and that those accusations that either my conscience or the devil or some suppose that God's accusing them, that those accusations somehow aren't really true about me. I'm more than that. So what does it mean to cover yourself? When I think of covering and hiding, and I always think of these in like childish terms, you know, because in some ways when you watch little kids, that's what you see. Their responses are childish, you know. Did you do it? No, he did it, you know. And then you see kids, when they do something wrong, hide. But you can clearly see them in the room. But there they are, trying to cover themselves up and hide. And it's like, you're right there. So it's kind of ridiculous. So one of the ways we cover ourselves is this drive we have as human beings for material possessions. So in America, you know, he who has the most toys wins. And so some people, and this is in the early church discussed a lot in terms of social justice, some people have a lot of clothing in their closet. And a lot of it they don't wear. St. Basil the Great says that some of those coats that we have in our closet that we don't wear, that we stole them off the backs of the poor. He uses that sort of language. So many of us have a lot of material possessions that we don't use. And these are ways of insulating ourselves from death, insulating ourselves from the sense of mortality, because how does it feel to be homeless? How does it feel to not have the clothes that you need? Well, it feels vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable, death is a threat. And we know that naked people on the streets do die. That it actually happens. People die that way. So we look for some sort of security within the material realm. But it's never just enough. Even our body, it's never just enough to feed ourselves. We also our body wants to store fat for that skinny day when we're not going to have food so we can survive. And this is something we do not only physically but psychologically. We also cover ourselves by creating false identity. And I think of teenage lunchroom politics. You know, you got the goths over here and the preps over here and the so-and-sos over here. Very old analogy. But the point being is that ultimately these people have found refuges in their identity as a particular type of clan. And that identity comes with an attitude. It comes with a way of thinking about the world. It comes with a pedigree, because not anybody can just enter in and out. And so some of these statuses that we create, these brands that we create around ourselves, are forms of psychological coverings. You know, things that we tell ourselves about ourselves, again, so that we don't have to see the deep nakedness and shame that we might have. So, I've already said that, so I'll move on. The second category was that we hide. We avoid God. Well, how do we avoid God? Well, some people don't go to church. Some people stop praying. Some people They actually distract themselves. They absorb themselves in entertainment or in education. You can, just about anything can be avoidance of God, because if they're in the back of your heart or your mind, there's a still small voice tugging at you saying, come home, and you watch another episode, or you play another video game, or you pursue anything, this is the way we generally hide from God. We also avoid seeing ourselves, and we talked about this with the false identities, but those false identities are a way, again, of not seeing our own true self. And so we create inflated versions of ourselves. Maybe you know about some narcissists. I can't imagine in our society you'd know about any narcissist, would you? But maybe you also know someone who hates themselves, who's just the worst person, and they know it, and they're going to tell you about it. There's lots of people like that as well, who have such a bad feeling about themselves that that's what they portray about themselves. That's also a type of false identity where we're hiding. And this is a quote from St. Ambrose of Milan. It says, "The guilty conscience is so burdensome that it punishes itself without a judge and wishes for covering, and yet is bare before God." We know about the blame game because we are aware of modern politics. And it is never my fault, the problems. We blame our circumstances. We blame our parents, our society. Just the other day in prison, someone was talking about if they were just in a monastery and not in prison, they could be closer to God. I was like, no, well, the faith will teach you should find God where you are. Because I could say that too. Just because I'm a priest, I should not be a priest and I'll be closer to God, because it's stressful being a priest. And there's always some other greener pasture where if I'm there, I'll be closer to God. The truth is that greener pastures are always a way of directing the responsibility away from me and my pursuit of God towards something that is unrealistic. That I think that if only the situation was right, then I would be the person I want to be. Well, anyways, most people, when they suffer, ultimately because God is all-powerful, in the end, many people turn and rail against God. God, why? Why did you put me here? Why are you doing this to me? Why did you give me a cold on the day I had to give a presentation? And so we hear a lot of angry whys, especially within the counseling setting when people are getting real. And you see a lot of people out of anger, disengaging from church, disengaging from anything that has to do with Christianity when they lose something that they don't believe they should have lost. And it's very painful. So those are the typical fallen human responses. So without training, we are prone to choosing death over life. We, as human beings, are more prone towards death than life. When we experience the shame of our choices, when we ever see ourselves as naked or somehow empty or not adding up, we like to cover, we like to hide, we like to blame. Ultimately, Genesis 3 is about you and me. So whether or not you believe in it literally or not, wonderful. You can argue about that somewhere else. But what you can say is that the story is ultimately about who we are. Our choices do matter. And this is a very simple analogy my parishioners will be familiar with. Every time we choose something that is not healthy, we choose death, or if we choose to sin, we choose to disobey. I don't have to use the word sin, but I can say that sin is disobedience. And I can also say that sin is turning away from life, turning away from God and turning towards death. It's doing things in our modern culture we would say that are psychologically unhealthy and physically unhealthy, that are not good for other people. Every time I choose that, I throw a rock into the water and it creates a ripple. And you see, we're all interconnected. So I throw my rocks into the water and you throw your rocks into the water. And we live in a culture that's very tumultuous. And it's because we're busy throwing rocks into the water and blaming, covering, shaming, whatever it is, and not taking responsibility for ourselves, But that eventually creates a tidal wave that overtakes us, symbolically and in reality. It leads to, you wonder why wars happen. You wonder why divorces happen. You wonder why these tragedies in life, all the tragedies we can think of, come from us ignoring the fundamental thing that each one of us contributes in some way, to the ripples in the world. And so, one of the reasons to learn about suffering and to learn about redemptive suffering is to begin to pull back from stirring up the waters and to begin to be a presence of peace within the world. First within ourselves. It's coming to peace within ourselves, but then also being a presence of peace in the world, because now, well, if we follow the example of Christ, when people sinned against Christ, He did not, in turn, sin against them. He says, love your enemies. And so that is the only thing that stops the waves. Forgiveness, compassion, love for your enemies, love for your neighbors. These are the fundamental messages of the Christian gospel. All right. Now we're going to talk about, first I'm going to do this little review here. There is a possibility of redemptive suffering. We need a load-bearing frame, the faith perspective. This is what I talked about last week. You can watch that. It's on YouTube. It's on our podcast, St. Innocent Orthodox Church, if you missed it. Basically, I outline these 4 premises. The reason why they're so important is because if you believe differently about God or man, it sets you on a different course and it makes you look for different results. You know, they say a ship that's off 1 degree can entirely miss an island. Well, Christian theology and our spiritual life is very much the same. The direction we set the rudder of our spiritual life is very important because it determines where we're going to ultimately arrive. So those 4 points that I mentioned. Let's do a case study. We have Joseph here. Joseph is a favorite of his father. His father, possibly unwisely, singles him out, gives him a wonderful, beautiful coat. And all of his other brothers are jealous. He interpreted these dreams, which when you read this book in Genesis 50, when you read about it, you know, Joseph is this younger brother who, in a sense, challenges his older brother by not only being special, but also eventually saying that at some point they're all going to bow down before him. In these sort of society, there's a pecking order, and he stepped out of it. In response to this, because of their jealousy and envy, they throw him into the pit. They steal his coat of many colors. They bring it back to the father stained with blood to say that he's died. They didn't want to leave him to die in the pit, so they sold him into slavery. He ends up down in Egypt serving as a slave. He goes through a lot of other turmoil, one of which is that the wife of the Pharaoh accuses him of trying to assault her, falsely accuses him. Anyways, he ends up in prison. In prison, the Pharaoh has a dream, and I'm summarizing the story for those of you who might not know the story, but I encourage you to read it. It is a lengthy story. In the end, what ends up happening is there's a great famine, and the brothers come down, and they are seeking food in Egypt. And lo and behold, now their brother is at the right hand of the Pharaoh and is in charge of the food because he was the one who interpreted the dreams and was put in charge of these sort of things. And this is what he says when they finally realize it's him, because at first they don't know it's him, because when they threw him in the pit, he doesn't look like he looks now. And now he's dressed in that garb, and he's of this different he has different mannerisms, so they don't really know him. But when he reveals himself, he says, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. So Joseph has a sense, so this is strange. He's been sold into slavery, but he's saying that God sent me before you to preserve life. So there's obviously in here some sort of faith perspective coming into play where Joseph sees even the evil committed against him is somehow usable by the providence of God. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is in this day, to save many people alive. So at the end of the story, we know there's this redemption. The family comes down and ends up living in Egypt. And but this is an incredible faith perspective to say that from him that you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. So we have this concept within our culture of silver linings. Now I want to tell you that for Joseph to say this makes sense. Joseph is at the right hand of the Pharaoh. Everything's good for him. Do you think he was saying this while he was in jail? Well, at the faith perspective, he would be. The Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter sang while they were in jail and felt like it was God's providence that had them there. So yes, if he had the faith perspective, he would say the same thing. But I want to give you, sometimes things happen that cause us to suffer, only to find out later that the things were somehow made better for us than they would have if we did not suffer. But I want to give you a word of caution. When you're with people who are suffering, try to avoid silver linings. The reason why is because silver linings are all very dismissive. You think about people with their tragic situations, even though it works out good. I mean, think of Job. I mean, he loses, in the book of Job, Job loses everything, his family and all that. He never gets that family back. He gets new rewards and new family after his severe trials. But some people, you don't want to be saying, well, it all worked out good for you. You know? Recently, I said in the last class, I had a tree fall in my house. And in the end, it worked out really well for me. But I have a few more gray hairs. And there was a lot of stress. And the last thing I probably wanted to hear at the beginning of that was like, oh, it'll be fine. You know, look, you'll probably even end up with a better house. But we say those things because we're uncomfortable with the other people's sufferings. Because being in front of someone who is suffering and just being with them is uncomfortable for me. And so I need them to get out of it. I need them to see the happy time, the silver lining, so that I don't want them to be depressed. But ultimately it's so that I don't have to co-suffer with them. So be aware of silver linings. They are part of our faith tradition because oftentimes God works all together for good for those who love Him. But be aware in your personal life that those aren't something that we always offer to people. Those are something that the people after they've suffered may retrospectively offer to us. That's the better and safer approach. Another case study from St. Paul. This one is interesting. Paul has this problem. Unless he should be exalted above measure by the abundance of revelations. You know, Paul is in the third heaven. He's got all these amazing revelations. He's learned the gospel. No man taught him the gospel. He says, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger from Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. We have no idea what this is. It could be a demon, a messenger from Satan. It could be a physical ailment. Some have said that he had eye problems. It could be any given weakness. He doesn't say anything about it. But here are his assumptions. One, the thorn in the flesh was given to him. So it was given to him, and the first purpose is that was given to him so that he wouldn't be overly exalted. So some of my sicknesses may be to actually humble me. But he says it's a messenger from Satan. God loves Paul and has ordered his life to lead him to salvation. The thorn in the flesh is somehow by God's providence. He seems aware of this. And it keeps Paul from, as I said, being exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. So Paul pleads with God for deliverance. That means that God is there, He exists, he knows God loves him, and he knows that if he asks God, God may actually heal him. And so he pleads with him not just once, he doesn't like it. He doesn't like the thorn in his flesh. God, take this away from me 3 times. I would assume fervently. God can heal me if it is His will to do so. So there's some faith there. God says to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. So Paul is not delivered. He does not get what he wants. He's asked 3 times fervently, but nothing changes. The only thing that changes is that God speaks to him. We don't know how he speaks to him, but he conveys to him that his grace is sufficient. You can function as an apostle with this thorn in your flesh. That this is something that you'll continue to have. Paul's suffering is again, how providential, and God can take it away, but God has decided somehow that this is not going to be taken away. Now, I was taught when I was first Christian in a prosperity gospel church that if I asked for something to be taken away and God didn't take it away, it was because I didn't have enough faith. But that's not really biblical. That's not scriptural. So this is what Paul does with this. Therefore, most gladly will I rather boast in my infirmities. So now the thorn in the flesh is not just a pain that keeps me from being exalted and that I want to get rid of. All of a sudden now it's a badge of honor. It's something that God, that somehow providentially has been given to me for I would rather boast in my infirmities that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Because if I didn't have this thorn, it would be my power and my energy, but this thorn in my flesh made me rely on God's power and God's energy. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now that's a hard teaching, because we're taught to be strong and from our youth, and we don't want to be weak or vulnerable. So Paul knows he's fallen, so he assumes, you notice here, he's not arguing with God, but God, I said I got a thorn in my flesh and you need to get it out, because I got some plans and you're messing my plans up. That's the way I think. That's the way many people think. Paul's suffering is involuntary, but then it turns into voluntary suffering. You'll notice that it's, I don't want this, I'm asking you to remove it, to all of a sudden it's a badge of honor. I accept this because it's obviously you didn't remove it, so it's a part of my salvation. It's something that is useful for me in my growth towards Christ. Paul's suffering has value because he has this faith perspective that makes it that the meaning comes ultimately from God. And that's how Paul transforms this situation. Let's do one more case study with Jesus. And ultimately, as Christians, he's our model for our lives. And I was thinking about it as I was doing this, it's like, what does it mean to follow Christ? A lot of the things I was taught about following Christ initially, they were happy things, they were joyful things, but they somehow ignored a lot of the aspects of Jesus' life, his suffering. And so in some of our spiritual tradition within the Orthodox Church, we talk about following Jesus not only to the cross, but dying with Jesus and rising with him. But we follow him in all of that experience. In other words, at times we will feel abandoned by God. At times we will be like in the Garden of Gethsemane asking whatever God has given us to take that cup away. But Jesus voluntarily suffers. This is a very important point in the early church. Jesus appears to be a victim because he's innocent, and people kill him even though he's innocent. And they free a robber instead of freeing Jesus. And then they kill the innocent Jesus instead of the robber, Barabbas. So the fathers will talk, the early church commentators will say that and this is throughout our hymnology, is that he went to his voluntary suffering, that he chose to do this as obedience to God. Now this also comes from the confession that Jesus Christ is the God-man. So if God doesn't want to suffer, God doesn't have to suffer. So there's a power thing here where Jesus says, all of a sudden, we can picture like it would be done in the movies nowadays. Let's say Jesus gets off the cross and the entire world is going to be wiped out at that point because he is all-powerful, at least in our theology. Of course, we know he doesn't get off the cross. The point is that, I lost my point. You'll forgive me, though. You will. Jesus innocently suffers. This is an important part also, because, I will explain later, but he's not suffering for his own sins. He didn't cause more ripples. He didn't cause the waves. He takes on the shame of Adam and Eve. And if you ever have been to a Bible study, maybe you've heard it about Genesis 3. But Jesus takes on the crown of thorns. The crown of thorns are what were promised to Adam when he tilled the ground. That he would till the ground and sweat and sweat and sweat, and it would just produce thorns. Jesus wears those on his head as a sign of royalty. He becomes cursed, naked. Think of it. Adam and Eve, they fall and they cover themselves because they're naked and ashamed. Jesus, although the image doesn't depict this for modesty's sake, Jesus was crucified entirely naked and outside the gate where everybody could look at him and walk by. So for pastoral reasons, our iconography doesn't depict him fully naked. They put a cloth on him. But he's naked and he doesn't attempt to cover himself. So we see in Jesus' death an image of him doing exactly what Adam and Eve didn't do. He does not blame. He does not justify himself to Pontius Pilate. He does not argue with the Sadducees. He does not try to find a way out of it. He does not do anything except for, as the Isaiah says, as a sheep led to the slaughter, that he was blameless and that he was mute. He was quiet. And he puts himself in God's hand. We see this in two places. But Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and he falls on his face and he says, "Oh my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." So Jesus, this is an indication of his voluntary suffering. And it's a transformation also of involuntary, I know that this is going to happen to me, to voluntary. Not my will be done, but your will be done. That's a fundamental aspect of the Christian life, is we, in the Lord's Prayer and in all sorts of different ways, we're constantly saying, I don't want my will on earth to be done. I want your will on earth to be done. And here's a little prayer that I thought of for pragmatic purposes, when we're suffering, and say, "Oh Lord, I would never choose to suffer in this way. But I find myself in this situation. And if it is possible, take the suffering away from me. Nevertheless, whether it is taken away or not, let your will be done." Because when we're suffering, it's totally okay to ask God to help us and to save us and to stop the suffering. But there always has to be an open that says, nevertheless, your will be done. Because we don't also want to, that shows humility, that shows that sense, that faith perspective, that it's possible that this suffering that I want taken away so immediately may have some purposes that are outside of my human understanding. Jesus was innocent. Generally, we are not innocent. So, we are not innocent, which means that a lot of the sicknesses and illnesses, and we didn't talk about this a lot, but if we go through the causes of suffering, I went briefly through, but it's like a lot of our suffering is just unnecessary, and it's stuff that we've made for ourselves. I mentioned last week that I like to overeat, and that I might eventually end up with diabetes, or I may end up with heart disease, and it's completely unnecessary. I don't have to do that. I could actually try to eat healthy, and exercise and do things. But because I want to comfort myself and cover myself with food, figuratively and literally, or fat, then, So anyways, there's an aspect of this where Jesus doesn't have to take responsibility for the sins of the world, but he does. But we do have to take responsibility of the world because we sin. Because we do all those things that everyone else does. And so this also will help us with our judgmentalism. If you find somebody who offends you or someone who sins against you, try to find in yourself how you participate in that same sin. We may have a problem with rapists within our culture, and I think we should have a problem with them, right? But we don't seem to have a problem with lust in our culture. But that's what one leads to the other. And sometimes we have a problem with maybe rapists in our culture, but we don't have a problem with lust in ourselves. But that's ultimately one step, a few steps away from the acts. So it's taking responsibility when we're suffering, and the question could be asked, it's like, how is there something I did to contribute to this? And so I've come up with a prayer, oh Lord, show me any areas of my life that have contributed to my suffering. Help me to see myself more clearly. Help me to shed my mask. Help me to put away the delusion. How have I contributed to it? Now, sometimes we are totally innocent, and the suffering that comes to us has nothing to do with us. Sometimes it's not that case. And so, discernment is needed. But we can also be like Christ and take responsibility for other people. When I see, as a practice, when you see people sinning, a lot of people just judge them and say, man, that guy's a real jerk. He's doing all these things. He's a terrible person. Total narcissist. I don't know how he became. Anyways, no, I'm just kidding. That could be said. But maybe someone might say that, but they say, Lord, help him. I know I have some of those same sins, and they're in me. God forgive him and help me too. It's much better than being judgmental and essentially throwing another stone in the ocean to create waves. We have to learn to accept shame. Shame demands that you do something, but you don't have to do anything. You actually don't have to. So, we are not saved. This is a quote by Father Stephen Freeman, who has a lot of wonderful articles on shame that you can find at his blog. We are not saved by our talents and our gifts, nor by our excellence. We are saved by our weakness and our failure. So if you're a Christian, or if and this whole class is about traditional Christian thoughts on this, Christians shouldn't be out there trying to say how great they are and how healed they are. Ultimately, it's a very humble faith. Not many wise, not many put together or chosen, as a paraphrase of the Apostle Paul. Now, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that we don't have value. We have value in Christ, but left to our own devices, I can easily say that I am worthless. And we have prayers, our prayer books, it says, I am worthless. And some people are like, oh, well, I'm not worthless. God loves me. In and of myself, I very rarely do anything of value. But if I'm prayerful, and if God gives me grace, the things that I do have value. So there's a paradox here. The paradox is that every Christian should feel like a sinner, and also know that God can cover them, heal them, and make them more than what they are. So accepting the shame acknowledges these many layers. In Christianity, we do not have to save ourselves. I do not have to prove to myself or somehow justify myself before God, because the theology tells me that Jesus died for me. I don't have to go die for myself, And there's nuances here, but I'm not going to get into them because it would just be a very long side trail. If you need clarification, just ask later. We do not need to save ourselves or justify ourselves. And it's good to acknowledge that my conscience has fallen, and so sometimes it misfires, my conscience. And also the devil is accusing me. And that the devil only tells half-truths. And that with whole truths, we're able to dismiss the devil. So one way to look at that might be that prayer to say that, when I look at my shame and when I experience myself, I feel pretty worthless. Well, that's true. I am worthless. It's okay. But Jesus loved me enough to die for me. That would be the Christian thought process. So obviously I'm of inestimable worth in God's eyes. My worth isn't about how I feel about myself. It's about how ultimately having a perspective from God. And I would encourage you not to fight the devil. When I say that, what I mean very specifically is that many people argue with themselves and argue with the devil. The devil accuses you that you're a loser, or that you're You should have done something better. And you're going to talk to him and say, well, no, I did this, and you're going to self-justify and argue. And this is also the same with our conscience. Our conscience sometimes tells us things. And you see a lot of people pursuing careers, doing all sorts of, trying to achieve all sorts of things based on the fact that something in the back of their heart or their mind is telling them that they're not enough. And they got to prove that thing wrong. Don't fight with the devil. So rather accept what's said. And I think that even, I've never been known for stealing. But even if the devil were to say, hey, you're a thief, okay, whatever. God, I'm a thief, help me, I mean, why should I argue about that? But the thing is the devil typically tells us things that are more real than that, things that he actually sees in us, that are more true than that, things that we don't want to see about ourselves. So it takes bravery. Lord, it is true that apart from you I am whatever. The whole truth is that you know me as I really am and love me anyways, and that your grace is sufficient. This is the type of prayer that disperses demons, that gets rid of these, can get rid of some of the accusations. Another thing, and this comes from, again, this case study with Jesus and following his life. You notice Jesus never really argues with the devil. He only talks to him a few times, and then he either commands them or he quietly rebukes them. But there's never a lengthy discussion. He doesn't try to talk him out of anything. Turning to God in all things. In the liturgy, and we heard this for those of you who were at the church this Sunday here in the sermon, we take and we offer up the Eucharist gifts, and one of the phrases we say is that we're offering unto God thine own of thine own, which means whatever you have given me, I offer it back to you. And I was mentioning in the sermon that this is a pattern for life, that each moment and everything is an opportunity to offer it back to God. Everything we've been given, whether it's sickness, health, or the sickness and health of other people, even our sins can be offered back to God. Every moment's an excuse to make that connection and to pray. And that's ultimately one of the best ways to endure suffering, is to take everything that's in suffering and to try to make it an excuse to fervently pray, to turn to God. Now, there's a St. Nicolae Azicha, who is a Serbian saint in our church. He says, at the end of his life, he says, I would do anything to get 5 more minutes back in Dachau, the prison camp, because that's where he had found God. There's other stories like that. There's other stories like that, Father Roman Braga, and different stories of where people were going through these extreme atrocities, but it was where people found Christ. It was where they found God, was in their sufferings. And that was so meaningful to them that they would do anything to have that moment back. And so it's very a profound thing to say that, when we're talking about our life and our suffering, that oftentimes we want to squirm out of it and get out of it, but it may be the very thing that we need to be held into so that we can find Christ. But it requires us to turn to Him, and we go back to that first phrase by Father Hopko. We either turn to Him and it becomes transformational, or we turn in on ourselves and it can become destructive. Suffering can. So, we shall draw near to God not by trying to avoid the sufferings inherent in all loves, but by accepting them and offering them to Him, throwing away all defensive armor, if our hearts need to be broken, and if God or He chooses this as a way in which they should break, so be it. And this is throughout the Christian tradition, which is essentially that sometimes it's in your lowest moments that you find Christ. Actually, I interestingly had a friend who used to discredit Christianity. He was Buddhist, and he would say, why is it that all these crack addicts are always finding Jesus in the back of a cop car? It's like, because when you've gone that far with your life and it's that empty, where else can you turn? And so sometimes some people have to go that low So that's part of this contemplation. So let me review a little bit, give you a final thought, and we'll wrap up for some questions. Our fallen reactions to suffering perpetuate suffering and, of course, can increase it for ourselves and others. And so the goal of the Christian life is not to stay within your fallen self. It's to put off the old man, to put on the new man. So we are asked to take up our cross and follow Christ. And so the possibility of redemptive suffering happens when we are humble like Christ, when we're able to take responsibility like Christ, when we can accept shame like Christ in that vulnerability, and when we learn to turn to God in all things rather than away from Him and towards our own self-understanding. The final thought within Christianity is, and this could be a silver lining, is that ultimately, in the end, it's worth it. Because for I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed to us. Now, Paul takes hope in that statement. He takes hope in that because even if it's that bad here, and I still commit myself to God who judges the living and the dead, as Jesus did on the cross, there's a potentiality. And we read in the gospel this past week about Lazarus and the rich man, and Lazarus suffers his whole life, and then he finds himself in paradise partially because of his sufferings. That we may take hope in that this life isn't the ultimate end-all be-all, that there's something beyond it. This was all traditional Christians look to the kingdom of heaven as some sort of ultimate inspiration, because even if it doesn't work out here, there's always there. Are there any, thank you for coming out, and are there any questions that need to be clarified in any way?